Most Australians know in their guts that the pretty wonderful place we live in today can't have a bad history. I mean, a bad history does not produce a good present.
Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast at the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. Welcome to our first Afternoon Light Live for 2026. And today's conversation for us here at the Robert Menzies Institute could not be more apt to start our year's activities. It is one on history, and not just any history, of course, but our history, Australia's history. It's our inheritance, it defines our identity and our values, and it tells us from where these essential building blocks for our nation come. It's an honour to have our guest here with us today, Tony Abbott, the 28th Prime Minister of Australia and the author of a new extremely important book on Australian history. And I think, given all of that, there is no one better to speak on this topic, perhaps apart from Geoffrey Blaney. I think you'd agree, Tony. Look, until quite recently, it was taken for granted that Australia was a country its citizens could take pride in. We are a nation with an Indigenous heritage, a British foundation and an immigrant character. But this confidence over the last 20 years has frayed. I think you'll all agree. And it's not because Australia's past has ever been perfect, it surely hasn't, but because it is increasingly presented as little more than a catalogue of failure, of injustice and shame. So through Tony's book, he's attempted to arrest a serious decline, which we share great concern for here at the Robert Menzies, in Australian historical literacy, and he's attempting to rebalance our national story. And this book is really special because at its heart, it has a conviction that it's individuals that matter, that nations are built not by words and deeds, but by people, for better or worse, and that each generation has a responsibility not just to judge the past, but to understand it and be worthy of what it is inherited. Now, today is the 20th of January, and for those of you who know your Robert Menzies history, it's a particularly fitting day for a discussion of the role of individuals in our history because it is the 60th anniversary of Sir Robert's announcement of his retirement from the Prime Ministership and political life. Well, without further ado, Tony Abbott, welcome to Afternoon Light Live.
Georgina, it's lovely to be here, and it's lovely to be at this fabulous institute commemorating the lifetimes and the good works and the ongoing legacy of our longest-serving Prime Minister.
Well, it's great to have you here, Tony, and you can see we're in a building steeped in history, not just Menzies history, but Australian educational history. This book, Tony, is fabulous. There's a documentary series that also accompanies it. It was a big project for a former Prime Minister to undertake. What inspired you to undertake this gargantuan task?
Well, Georgina, at first I should say that, yes, it was a very big project, but I had a bit of help, some seriously good help, including from Alex McDermott, who you're very familiar with. He and the wonderful Andrew Kemp made a terrific contribution to the work, and I really must acknowledge them because without their help and assistance and guidance on so much, it wouldn't be the comprehensive work that it is. It would have been more a piece of advocacy than a piece of what I regard has turned out to be reasonably objective, pretty impartial, I hope, a history of record. So yes, it was a great piece of work, thanks in large measure to the great help I had. But it was a very necessary piece of work, I think, because as Blaney pointed out in the 90s, the old Three Cheers version of Australian history has become the black armband version of Australian history, and it's even worse now than it was then. I mean, the long march of the left through the institutions was at that stage incomplete. I think it's much more comprehensive today than it was then. And so the Invasion Day version of Australian history, this idea that our country was founded in an act of fundamental injustice, that it proceeded through violence, exploitation, even genocide, that it continues to this day in an unjust, racist, sexist, homophobic kind of a way. I'm not saying we're perfect, Georgina, obviously. There were pretty brutal things that happened to Aboriginal people along the way, and occasionally there were some pretty brutal things done to the settlers along the way. The convicts didn't exactly have a great life, certainly by today's standards, even if in some respects, as I point out in the book, it was better than the life many of them would have had they stayed in Mother England. But on balance, it's a great story. Our first century in particular, I think, is a story of almost incandescent success. From the very beginnings of 1,500 bedraggled souls dumped half the world away in Sydney Cove. Within a century, they had created a series of self-governing colonies that didn't just have the world's highest standard of living at that time, but they were extraordinary democratic pioneers. I mean, by the 1890s in South Australia, people of both sexes and all races could vote. Women and Aboriginal people, at least in theory, could run for Parliament, and even back then a couple of women did. They didn't succeed initially, but nowhere in the world at that time was this true, except here in Australia. If we go forward, the 1890s saw the unification of the 6 colonies, not through a coercive process, not because the Imperial Parliament forced it upon us, but because local leaders thought it was going to help in a whole host of ways, economically, strategically, and through a long process of discussion, negotiation, compromise, and ultimately democratic votes. And again, almost unique in the world, they brought a new nation into being, a continent for a nation and a nation for a continent. Australia Unlimited, Australia Felix. And I just think that we should be so proud of that. We should be so proud of the contributions that we have made as a Commonwealth here and abroad, our extraordinary contribution, particularly in the Great War, the way in the post-Second World War era we brought migrants in, initially from Europe, more recently from all over the world. And whatever difficulties we have and whatever problems we may currently be grappling with, it's been, again, an extraordinary social experiment that has succeeded beyond anything that we ever could have expected. And that's a wonderful tribute to the quality of all the people who have comprised this great nation over the last 200 odd years.
It's really interesting to reflect on your description of the evolution of Australian democracy through the colonial period to federation. And I think as Australians, we do our past a great disservice by not reflecting on the miracle of that.
Yeah.
To think what else was happening in the world in the late 18th century, early 19th century, that, you know, there were revolutions, there's a lot of blood lost over experimentations towards independence and democracy. And yet in Australia, it was a relatively peaceful evolution. And of course, the beneficiaries of the liberal Enlightenment ideas coming out of Britain and Europe meant that we sort of received the best of the minds from that part of the world, but didn't have to import a lot of the sort of more difficult parts.
If we look back over the past, 20 or 30 were killed in the so-called Castle Hill Rebellion in the early 1800s. I guess at Eureka we had 20 or 30 deaths. Yes, there were obviously some pretty dark episodes on the frontier of settlement, mostly, I guess, settlers killing Aboriginal people. Occasionally, there was some pretty serious, countermeasures, particularly in Tasmania from the Aboriginal people. But yeah, when you think that over the centuries Europe has been drowned in blood, we've got off pretty lightly and done remarkably well.
Tony, in your book, you address the frontier wars and the atrocities committed against certain Aboriginal people through the early colonial period and, of course, beyond. How do we come to grips with that part of our history?
Well, I suppose the first thing to say is that we can't change our history. It is what it is. And the second thing to say is that we should judge the people of yesterday by the best standards of their time, not by the standards of these times. I think it's very unfair to go back 100 years and do a critique of what people said according to contemporary canons of political correctness, for instance. Now, yes, there is no doubt that there were going to be clashes. as soon as the settlers pushed out beyond the initial encampments around Sydney Harbour in the search for fertile lands, as soon as they started fencing, housing, grazing, obviously the waterholes, the wildlife that the Aboriginal people had relied on, it was going to become contested space. And inevitably, given that the settlers had the superior weaponry in any contest, they were going to mostly come off better. I mean, one of the points I make in the book is that the Tasmanian Aboriginals actually conducted quite a successful defence of their land. There were a lot of settler casualties as well as a lot of Aboriginal casualties. But the interesting thing is, Georgina, that even then, at the times when frontier conflict was at its worst, officialdom was constantly stressing to the settlers that the Aboriginal people of Australia had all the rights of British subjects and that a white person would be hanged for the murder of a black person and vice versa. Now, the truth is that the only time we can be confident that white people really were punished according to law was after the Myall Creek massacre. But again, while this in some respects is perhaps the biggest blot on our national story, the wanton butchery of up to 30 Aboriginal men, women and children by a party of stockmen, there was a sequel. And the sequel was an extraordinarily humane Irish Catholic Attorney General, John Plunkett, was determined that justice would be done. Even after the first jury refused to convict, he managed to bring new charges against a slightly smaller number of the defendants. And after the judge at the second trial said that this atrocity cried out to heaven for justice, the jury did convict and 7 white men were hanged, as they should have been under the standards of those times, for the murder of black people. Now, it wasn't always as good as that. A few years later, as we know from the contemporaneous historical record, someone called Cootes up on the north coast of New South Wales did indeed poison flour after his sheep had been regularly speared by the local people. Some 20 Aboriginal people died. Again, the wonderful Plunkett tried to bring this ne'er-do-well to justice. In this case, alas, the only witnesses were Aboriginal, and it was, in those days, thought that Aboriginal people could not testify in court because they could not swear on a Bible, and so the odious Cootes got off. But again, to Plunkett's credit, he tried to change the law to provide for Aboriginal people's ability to give testimony. He failed by 1 vote in the New South Wales Legislative Council, so it was another decade or so before that situation was rectified, and it was probably the 1860s and 70s before Aboriginal people generally could give testimony in Australian courts. But here we are in this country, supposedly, if you take a lot of modern historiography seriously, supposedly this den of racism, and yet by the 1870s, Aboriginal people were equal with white people, at least when it came to giving testimony in a court of law. So it's not a perfect story, as we say, but it's a pretty good story, And I just think that we do ourselves justice not by pretending it was all good or by pretending that it was all bad. We've got to see it in its totality.
And when you talk about how our history has been shaped by individuals, I think you say if we have a history to be proud of, it's good people that have made it.
Correct.
So, I mean, someone like John Plunkett presumably is one of those good people with liberal ideas who
absolutely
was
right.
intent on
Absolutely
equality.
right. But even if we go to the early governors, I mean, we should never forget that the instructions that the British government gave to Governor Phillip were to live in amity with the native people. Going back even further, we've got Cook really appreciating the Aboriginal people in a way that others hadn't, because he said that they lived in a state of harmony and in a state of, I suppose, balance which was beyond the ken of even the English people of those days, who were acquisitive and greedy and all the rest of it. So the best of the settlers, the best of the governors were men of deep humanity, considerable magnanimity. As I said, the only one of the early governors who was really a bit of a bastard was Bligh, and he practiced his bastardry mostly against the settlers as opposed to against the Aboriginal population.
I mean, for want of being parochial, but of course we'll be parochial, I was very pleased to read your praise of the sort of liberal project that was South Australia and the development of the colony of South Australia in the 1830s.
Yep.
And, the really innovative policies and governance structures that were introduced to the colony of South Australia that probably most South Australians don't know, let alone Australian citizens.
Well, again, I think one of the reasons why this book has been, so far at least, extremely well received is because most Australians know in their guts that the pretty wonderful place we live in today can't have a bad history. I mean, a bad history does not produce a good present. And given that, on balance, notwithstanding some things that we might wish improved, it is a great country, even if we might be letting ourselves down in some important respects. A great country can't have been the product of a horrible past. So I think people sense deep down that it is a good history, or at least it would be a good history if they were familiar with it, and they instinctively are uncomfortable with the black armband invasion day, we're all a bunch of racists narrative. And this book has, in a sense, validated their instincts by telling them a better story than the one that we typically get from the sort of historians that go onto the ABC or publish in The Age.
Or appear at Writers' Festivals.
Or indeed appear at Writers' Festivals. Now,
although you were going to.
I was invited.
Yeah, you were. That was an aberration, Tony.
And to give...
Some of us have speculated that's why they cancelled Adelaide Writers' Week. It wasn't Randa Abdel Fattah, it was you.
That's right. Well, look, to give the former publisher of Melbourne University Press her due, she did publish my book Battle Lines, and I'm very grateful to her. And I have a personal friendship with Louise Adler, even though she and I would radically disagree on almost everything. And she did... ring me before Christmas, very insistent that I should appear at the Adelaide Writers' Week, and I was very happy to do so, and I'm sorry that it's been cancelled. Funnily enough, unlike Ms. Randall Fattah, my invitation has not been renewed for next year.
Well, you heard it here first, and perhaps that will be reviewed and renewed. Tony, we're 20 minutes into our bit of the chat, and we haven't even got to the 20th century, but perhaps there's a reason for that because the 19th century, people are so unfamiliar with it. But there was a very important moment, the beginning of the 20th century, and that was, of course, our Federation. Now, we had the 125th anniversary of Federation on New Year's Day, and probably most people were recovering from a small hangover from the festivities of the night before. But I didn't notice much commentary or the government making maybe they did and I just missed it with my said hangover, but I am astounded at how little focus is put on the miracle of Federation, the importance of Federation, and that when you talk about the sort of Australian myth-making, it's more about Gallipoli and the Anzacs and not about the Federation. Is there a reason for that, do you think, or is it because Australians don't like to... I think Australians are interested in their past, but institutionally we haven't been very interested in our past, and I think there's a disconnect there.
Look, that's a very good point. I guess we're not jingoistic flag wavers,
no.
And that's probably to our credit. But I do think, again, as a bit of a byproduct of the black armband view, at least in official circles, there is this ambivalence. We're coming up to Australia Day, and it seems somewhat muted this year, perhaps because of the impact of the Bondi massacre. But normally in the lead up to Australia Day, there's this chorus of criticism saying that this is not a day for anyone to celebrate because it marks the end of Indigenous sovereignty, so to speak. So I think it has been a bit contaminated, and I just think that we've got to get over ourselves, and I think we've got to accept that the history is what it is. On balance, our forebears acted with much more decency than not, and if we believe that we've got to make the most of things, well, we should honour what is, and with confidence that we are a decent people, go on to build the best possible future.
I'm going to skip ahead a bit, and I'm sure there'll be lots of great questions from our online audience about the war years, the Great War, the Second World War, and of course the Depression. But I'm really interested in how you deal with this idea of an immigrant character. Yep. Australia has an immigrant character. And the post-migration that, of course, was largely overseen by the government of Robert Menzies, but Ben Chifley did start it. It shaped Australian identity.
It certainly shaped our modern identity.
But I wonder how we can square the sort of modern iteration of multiculturalism with appeals for unity and patriotism that you talk about in your book.
Well, I want to draw a distinction, and it's pretty obvious to those who have got to the later chapters, but I want to draw a distinction between the official attitude to the post-war migration of the 50s and 60s and the official attitude to the migration of the 80s, 90s and beyond. Under the Caldwell immigration program that was then continued by Harold Holt and others, there was a very strong expectation that the non-British migrants would integrate on day one, often by going off or working on great projects like the Snowy Mountain Scheme, and assimilate as quickly as they could. Now, we know that people being people, many of our post-war European migrants formed their own clubs, sporting clubs, social clubs, inevitably fraternised amongst themselves. But quite quickly, through work, through sport, and the fact that people tended to spread out into the wider community, assimilation did take place. Genuine assimilation did take place. It started under Whitlam, and it was very much consolidated under Malcolm Fraser. This idea of multiculturalism, such that really it should be possible to maintain a kind of a separateness, this notion of hyphenated Australianism. The vast majority of our migrants, even in this modern era of official multiculturalism, have come to join us, not to change us. And notwithstanding government-funded ethnic activists, have tended to get jobs in the mainstream, to go to mainstream schools, to live in mainstream suburbs, and to join Team Australia. But I do think that the rise of a class of professional ethnic, if you like, often government-funded, in more recent times, the ability to, as it were, have a foot in two countries at once, thanks to cheap international air travel, thanks to the internet and the ability to go online and listen to global media wherever you are, I think risks creating not so much Team Australia as Hotel Australia, to coin a phrase, where people take advantage of what's on offer here without ever really doing what Bob Hawke urged us all to do on our bicentenary day in 1988, saying that it is the commitment to Australia that is all. That is the thing that brings us together, that strong civic commitment, that strong civic patriotism. And I think that's what we really have to double down on, particularly after 2 years of horrific anti-Semitism, Jew hatred, culminating in the Bondi massacre. I think we really have to say to everyone, much more strongly than we have in the recent past, that the words of the citizenship oath, they've got to be not just said, but they've got to be meant and lived. I mean, the citizenship oath says, from this time forward under God, I pledge my allegiance to Australia and its people, whose democratic beliefs I share, whose rights and liberties I respect, and whose laws I will uphold and obey. I mean, that's incredibly important. And it's not just something that you go and glibly mouth. You've got to mean it. You've got to live it. And frankly, if you don't mean it and you don't live it, this is not the place for you. Why are you here? If you're just here because you like what you've seen on TV, or your rallies have said that it's pretty easy to get government benefits or whatever it is, if you think that you can recreate some Chinese Communist Party cell in Australia, if you think that you can build a caliphate here in Australia, I'm sorry, that's un-Australian. So I just think that there's got to be a much stronger official emphasis on the Australian way of life, on our core Anglo-Celtic culture, on our foundational Judeo-Christian ethos. I really think we do need to be recalled to our best selves in the wake of the Bondi Massacre.
Values matter here, don't they? We've got 1 minute to go for our chat, Tony, and of course it would be remiss of me not to go to Menzies. You write about the Menzies era in a whole chapter, which is great. It deserved it, that it was an era of vast change, not the sort of sleepy, sleepwalking through the 50s, 60s that some particularly former Labor prime ministers would style it as. You talk about the US alliance, trade with Japan, ridding white Australia policy, the expansion of universities, greater political rights for Aboriginal people, the royal visit, that we were a tranquil and prosperous society and Australians had never had it so good. But then you say that Howard was our best prime minister and Hawke Labor's best prime minister, both quite contentious because most, I guess, experts would say Curtin is our best prime minister and therefore Curtin Labor's best prime minister. Your evaluation, there's lots in this. It's unfair. I have no minutes to give you. But your evaluation of Menzies.
Well, I think if you go to my last chapter, I say there was a strong case for saying that Howard was our best prime minister because I think he lived in some ways in more testing times than Sir Robert. I know no times are easy while you're living through them. It's only looking back that they look golden. It's only with the benefit of nostalgia that they look so wonderful. But, I mean, the 1950s and 60s was certainly a time when the long Anglo-American ascendancy really did look well set, very pervasive, notwithstanding the Cold War, which was yet to be won. And certainly there was no 24/7 news cycle. Our population was smaller. It was less diverse. Senates weren't as difficult. I think that it was harder for Howard to govern on a day-to-day basis than it was for Menzies. I actually think it's harder now than it was for Howard. It's one of the reasons why none of Howard's successors have come close to him in terms of achievements, myself obviously included. Look, Menzies almost certainly will never be surpassed in terms of political longevity. As long as the Liberal Party lasts, Menzies will be rightly hailed as the founder of what is still our most successful political party thus far. And whatever, I suppose, yelping and squelping there might be from the sidelines, by any objective standards, the Menzies era was a time of great economic advance, considerable social contentment, and that's to his everlasting credit. I mean, as I say in the book, I think, in the end, it's individuals who make the most of their own lives, and it's really only at the margins most of the time that government significantly impacts on them. Nevertheless, over time, government does make a vast difference, and the fact that we did so well for so long with Menzies at the helm is an extraordinary personal achievement of his. I mean, one of the other things that I guess writing this book really reinforced to me is the human factor in history. I mean, imagine if Halifax and not Churchill had become British Prime Minister in 1940. Imagine if someone else was the US president right now. How different things would be.
Imagine if Kamala Harris had won.
Yeah, the human factor in history is incredibly strong. And as it happened, we were very, very lucky that we had Menzies and not Doc Evatt, for instance, through that period. And I think we were lucky that we had Hawke and not Whitlam for that long stint of government, and that we had Howard and not Billy McMahon for his long stint of government. The human factor is incredibly important.
Yeah, it sure is. Look, I've got a huge line of audience questions here, Tony, so we'll try and whip through them. One from Helen Jersevich. She would like to know why there has been so much negativity about Australia in the last 20 years. I mean, you say recently in your book, I say 20 years. That's sort of my supposition. But
Well, again, Georgina, I think it is essentially the long march of the left through the institutions and the cultural Marxist left. Their passion is to destroy the patriarchy as they see it, to destroy the hegemony of the West as they see it, to overturn the, I guess, mindset of the Christian church. And for all sorts of reasons, some understandable, some less so, they've had a lot of success. And I think it's the job of people like us not to pretend that we are indeed blameless, but nevertheless to focus on our strengths and do our best to build on them.
Well, the question, of course, wasn't to me, but if I could put in my two bobs worth, I agree that there is an almost complete takeover of our institutions, of culture, media, education by the progressive side of politics. But the problem is the right hasn't put up any fight. There's a sort of a disinterest. There's a focus on, we'll make sure we're worried about the economy and defence, but education, well, that's sort of a left-wing policy area. Writers' Festival, well, just lefties go there. I mean, the trouble is if you ignore these institutions that shape our culture, it has political consequences.
Completely correct. If you do not fight culture wars, you lose culture wars. And frankly, our culture is too wonderful to be sacrificed through indifference. And that's what's happened over the last couple of decades, maybe even over the last couple of generations.
A question from Brian Herlock, who is here today. If Tony Abbott were the current Federal Minister for Education, what practical requests could he make of state education ministers to restore the teaching of Australian history as a standalone essential subject in the curriculum for high school students? And he does add, apart from the decree that Tony Abbott's Australia history be compulsory reading for every high school student in Australia, certainly be good for book sales too, Tony.
Well, look,
Having just paid the textbook bill for my children.
The truth is that it's very difficult for the Federal Education Minister to stretch his or her hands into every classroom. And frankly, you wouldn't want it to be, as it were, totalitarian as that anyway. I certainly think that a good state education minister would be very eager to do four things: more principal autonomy, more academic rigour, more parental involvement, and higher standards for teachers. I mean, when I was a youngster, only probably 30% of kids went on to year 12. And of those that went to year 12, probably only 10% or so went on to university. So, in a sense, there was an elitism, in the best sense of that word, about the final years of education at school, and there was certainly an elitism about university. And because inevitably there were smaller numbers of teachers required at those very senior levels, I think the quality was probably higher vis-a-vis the quality of other professionals in our society. I mean, at the schools I went to, at least some of the teachers in those days were actually Jesuit priests. And in those days at least, the smartest young Catholics, at least some of them, would go off and join the priesthood, because in a way that maybe now going into medicine or merchant banking is regarded as the best thing anyone could do, in those days, at least for a Catholic, joining the priesthood, or particularly an order like the Jesuits, was regarded as one of the very best things you could do. I mean, when I was a youngster, joining the Jesuits was almost the equivalent of becoming a member of a spiritual SAS. So I had some wonderful, wonderful teachers at school. These were outstanding people who would have done brilliantly in whatever profession they were in. Now, there are still fine people who go into teaching, don't get me wrong, but I don't think it is generally thought that the best of the best become teachers. And we need more of the best to become teachers. And we need to have more academic rigour in our schools. If you look at the comparative league tables of academic achievement by the year 8, year 10, etc., school kids in different countries. I mean, the Singaporeans and the Chinese and the Koreans are right up there.
Yeah.
I think the British and the Americans are still not doing too badly, but we're falling down the ranks with appalling rapidity.
Yeah.
And so we really do need, I think, an absolutely galvanic movement in our education system. Too many people go to university, frankly, these days.
Yeah.
I mean, the idea that 50% of school leavers should go off to university when only so many can be doctors, only so many can be lawyers, only so many can be engineers, only so many can be architects. What are all the others doing? They're doing XYZ studies, or they're doing marketing in this. And now we just don't need all of this. What we do need is we need more carpenters, we need more electricians, we need more welders, we need more builders, we need more IT coders, etc. And a lot of them aren't going to come out of university. In fact, I know we're getting a bit off the topic, Georgina, but I was not long ago in America and I spent a bit of time in the Peter Thiel ecosystem.
Yeah.
He's one of the tech bros who are so influential in contemporary America. And there are these things called Thiel Fellows, and Peter Thiel gives these bright young kids a couple of $100,000 on condition that they don't go to university. They don't go to university, and in fact, they start businesses, particularly high-tech businesses, and some of these people are doing remarkably well.
Yeah.
And the Thiel view is that if they go to university, many of them will have the imagination and the initiative driven out of them. And so often today, we find youngsters going from school to university effectively to put off adulthood for 3 or 4 years, and they get their heads filled with a lot of ideological nonsense in many cases. They accumulate $50,000 to $100,000 worth of debt. They waste a couple of years of their life, and they are no closer to getting a meaningful employment future. I mean, if you look at graduate salaries, the gulf between graduate and non-graduate salaries that was pretty substantial a generation ago is much, much smaller today.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think there is a debate, a genuinely thoughtful policy debate around the role of universities and university education that we haven't had.
Quite apart from the fact that so-called export education is effectively driving immigration numbers at the moment. And arguably, I would say, doing absolutely nothing for the quality of the education, given that so many of our overseas students are not as fluent in the language of instruction as they should be. And so many of these group assignments seem to be a way of ensuring that people who aren't as eloquent as they might be can still pass the exams.
A question from an academic here at Melbourne University, Holly Lawford-Smith, on a completely different topic, but she is someone who is expert in gender studies, I believe. So Holly has asked, in your book you describe Australia's relationship with Britain as more than an ethnic affiliation, that it's an intimate association. And she wants to understand, what do you mean by an intimate association? And we loved this question of Holly's. We've already discussed it in the office and have our own views, but what is yours, Tony?
Well, Churchill used to talk about the English-speaking peoples, and I think I stand in that tradition. I'm one of those people who think that the main English-speaking countries are, sure, juridically separate entities, but I don't think they're foreign in any meaningful sense. I don't think an Australian living in Britain feels like he's living in a foreign country. Likewise, I don't think Britons living in Australia feel like they're living in a foreign country. America's a little bit more exotic, but even in America, I think that Australians feel very much at home, and likewise Americans here in Australia. So I like to think that the main English-speaking countries are sort of sibling countries. And I think that other countries where English is widely spoken or where Western concepts of modernity have widely taken root, whether that's Singapore or India or Israel, maybe even Japan, are places which we have a great deal of, as it were, at homeness. And I want to see the brotherhood of men and women extended, but I think that you best create a kind of amicable world community by building on the associations that you've already got. And plainly, if we're talking about the main English-speaking countries, they've got associations of institutions, they've got associations of history, they've got associations of peoples, and let's make the most of all of that.
And question from Nick Warland. He would like to, without wanting to conflate topics, you've undertaken a magnificent project to defend and celebrate Australia's story and legacy. Why do Liberals, that's capital L Liberals, find it difficult to do the same in a political sense?
Okay. Well, look, I think that the quality of political leadership waxes and wanes. We had, I think, a high quality of political leadership in the Federation era. I certainly think that Menzies was a towering giant, but there were a lot of very strong lieutenants in that era. I think that the Hawke-Howard period was a bit of a contemporary golden age when we had 25 years of, on balance, pretty good government and a lot of economic reform, all of which was beneficial and much of it was overdue. I think that over the last decade and a half or so, things haven't been as good, and I just think that we need to encourage better people to take an interest in public life. And I think that's true on both sides of the fence. I mean, I look at the current front bench, Labor front bench, and I think of the Hawke front bench. I don't think even Prime Minister Albanese would put himself in the same league as Hawke. I certainly didn't put myself in the same league as Howard. And when I think of my front bench, well, some of the most able members of it were more interested in plotting than they were in governing. They were very talented people too, and very good at it as it happens.
Good plotters, yeah. Well, it is a political skill, and Robert Menzies certainly mastered the art of politics as well as the art of governing. But a question here from Chris O. The past is the past, he says. Today's Australia needs to take into consideration that today's multicultural society is vastly different from conservative politics of the past. Is conservatism still relevant to today's Australia?
Well, at heart, conservatism is respect for everything that's made us. Our family, our neighbourhood, our faith, the literature that we read, the history that we are helping to create in our own lives in big ways or in small ways. And there's got to be some kind of glue that holds Australia together. And at a very basic level, I suppose that's got to be the language that we speak. It's got to be the institutions that we contribute to and that preside over the commanding heights of our society. And I think it's got to be a knowledge and appreciation of our past. And the past is not just, as it were, the ethnic past, it's the cultural past. One of the many nice things that happened during the production of the doco, the Sky doco that you were part of, Georgina, was a discussion in a very multi-ethnic Anglican high school in Western Sydney. And the youngster in year 11 who knew best the story of the Anzacs was actually the son of Zimbabwean migrants. Now, you looked at this guy and he didn't look like your typical Anglo-Celtic Australian, I've got to say, but he talked about our ancestors. And if you're an Australian, doesn't matter whether your ethnic background is Chinese or Indian or African or Anglo-Irish, the Anzacs are our ancestors as Australians.
Well, I mean, as a comment, the winners of our high school speech competition last year, the 3 winners, were all the children of migrants, so first-generation Australians. So, they were talking proudly of their history as the kids of people who were born elsewhere. So I think, that's well shared by the younger generation. A question here from Dave Windsor. Great book, well written. Was a great interview earlier done by John Anderson about his ancestry. Have you, Tony, heard any other stories since publishing the book that might be inclined to include in the second edition?
Well, all the time I'm thinking to myself, maybe I need to do this in the next edition. And for instance, Georgina, you were good enough to give me, before this podcast began, a volume of Sir Robert Menzies' poetry. And there's a beautiful poem here, In Memoriam, to commemorate Lieutenant J.R. Balfe, who was obviously a classmate of Sir Robert's. And as we know, Sir Robert didn't serve in the Great War. And indeed, he was often criticised for that. And I suspect much of his subsequent life was, in a sense, his self-consciousness of the need to serve in the same way that his brothers had served and many of his contemporaries had served. So, I mean, this lovely poem that Sir Robert wrote at the time in 1915 probably should find its way into a second edition just to help explain Menzies' attitude to the Great War, and I guess to make it clear that it wasn't that he had no appreciation of the soldier's life, and indeed, in a sense, no desire to be part of it. I mean, this poem is no one who wrote a poem of this quality was someone who was indifferent to the life of a soldier.
No. It's a beautiful poem, and we would be very pleased if it was included in the second edition. This is more a political question than a question about history. From Philip Shaw, I sometimes say that the natural political home of every self-employed tradie in the country should be the Liberal Party, or at least the coalition, but this patently is not so at the present. Why is this? Perhaps this is an allusion to Tony's tradies.
Yeah, well, I agree with your questioner that tradies should be natural Liberals, but again, I think there has been a tendency in recent times in particular to go off on tangents. I mean, I kind of touch on the pandemic in the last chapter. I think the pandemic was an incredibly dispiriting time for natural Liberal voters in particular, because if you are a natural Liberal, you have an instinctive desire for less government and more freedom. And yet, during the pandemic, there was vastly more government and vastly less freedom. In fact, the people of Melbourne were oppressed by their government in a way that was utterly unprecedented, even in wartime, when it might have made at least some sense. So I think for Liberals, the pandemic was a really, really dispiriting time. And I think that's why a lot of people who should be Liberals or instinctively remain Liberals feel a bit disillusioned with the Liberal Party because, let's face it, all governments, including Liberal governments, state and federal, were complicit in the health dictatorship that we seem to become for at least 2 years.
Well, I know you write about the fact that there was no royal commission into how we dealt with the pandemic, particularly because we adopted the sort of Wuhan approach, the Chinese approach, rather than the approaches that we had practiced time and time again. And the same could be said for the UK too.
Exactly right. I mean, late in 2021, when the restrictions were starting to lift, I was in London. I only got to travel because it was official government business that I was there on as a honorary member of the British Board of Trade. But I was at an event in London and I came across the Swedish ambassador, would you believe? And I congratulated him for representing a country which alone had stood against the Wuhan plan. And he said to me, it was pretty weird. He said, we had just copied the British pandemic plan, totally copied the British pandemic plan. The difference was we followed it and Britain didn't.
Yeah,
and of course, Sweden had probably long run better health outcomes than Britain, and it certainly had vastly better economic outcomes, and I'd say vastly better mental health outcomes, because people weren't locked up for 2 years. They weren't under house imprisonment effectively for 2 years.
Yeah. A question here from Leon from Curtin Uni Rugby in the Golden West. As a Sydney Uni rugby stalwart, any chance of a guest coaching session when you're in town? We get all types here, Tony.
You do. Look, if I'm there during the rugby season and I've got a spare hour or so, mind you, in my day at Sydney University, we were still in the Brockhoff-Rosenblum era of rugby.
Remember, I come from South Australia. I have no idea what you're talking about.
I'm speaking a foreign language to you Aussie rules types.
Yeah.
But in that era, Sydney University believed that you won a scrum or you won a line-out, you gave the ball to the 5'8", who kicked it forward, and then you had another scrum and another line-out. And maybe when you got to within about 5 yards of the other person's try line, you'd try a push-over try. So that was... I don't know whether they want to play that in Western Australia.
That is literally Mandarin to me, Tony. But I'm sure that Leon from Curtin Uni Rugby understood.
Yes.
And that is the important thing here. One final question from me. Tony, you finished the book in the sort of, I guess, present-ish day. You talk about when does history become contemporary politics, current affairs. You became an MP in the 94 election. What are some of the key moments from your personal recollections that shape your chapter on the sort of more contemporary Australian history? And I guess particularly observing political opponents like Paul Keating, but John Howard and Bob Hawke and others.
Well, the Hawke-Howard era was an era of policy bravery, and I think it was an era of strong characters in our public life, people who were not necessarily saints, but who nevertheless were quite idealistic and were prepared to work together in a spirit of teamsmanship. So I guess that's something that I think helped to form me, and which I think is very important. If I look at, in particular at the Howard era, well, the East Timor expedition I thought was a real watershed in our national life. I think that our participation in the, I suppose, Islamism conflicts of the early years of this century was very important. I think that the policy bravery of the Howard government was important. Things like the citizenship test, which the Howard government introduced to supplement the modern citizenship oath that came in the Hawke-Keating era, I think were incredibly important. I mean, I guess the lessons that I learnt from Howard in particular, but to a lesser extent, including Hawke and Keating, was that it's better to have a go and fail than never to try.
Well, a great note to end on, Tony. Thank you so much for joining us on Afternoon Light Live. It's been a wonderful discussion, Tony. We are so grateful that you took this project on and wrote such an important book, and so accessible too. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.